The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Air Station Kingsville as Captain Sarah Mitchell sat at her desk, staring at the training application in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the pen, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. At 32 years old, she had already served 10 years in the military as a helicopter pilot. She had logged over 2,000 flight hours. She had flown combat missions in 3 different countries. And now, she wanted to fly the Apache. The AH-64 Apache was the most advanced attack helicopter in the world. It was a machine of pure power, equipped with missiles, rockets, and a rotating cannon that could fire at incredible speed. It was also a position reserved almost exclusively for men. In the entire Naval Aviation Unit at Kingsville, no woman had ever successfully completed Apache pilot training. In fact, no woman had ever even asked. Sarah set the pen to paper and signed her name with a firm hand. She was requesting a transfer to the Apache program. As soon as she signed those papers, she knew everything would change. But she had no idea just how much. The next morning, Sarah walked into the ready room with the transfer paperwork. The ready room was where pilots gathered before flights. It was the heart of the squadron. Men looked up from their coffee cups and flight plans. There were maybe 15 pilots in the room, all of them men, all of them staring at her. "I've got my transfer request," Sarah said simply, walking toward the commanding officer's desk. "I want to apply for Apache pilot training." For a moment, there was complete silence. Then someone laughed. It started as a single chuckle, then grew into multiple voices. Within seconds, the ready room erupted. Pilots were slapping their knees. One man literally had to set down his coffee cup to keep from spilling it. "You're going to fly the Apache," one pilot named Rick called out. He was a senior captain with 15 years of experience. "Mitchell, you fly the Huey. That's a nice machine. Why would you want to step up to something you can't handle?" "I can handle it," Sarah said quietly. "Have you ever fired a weapon system?" asked another pilot, Dave Morrison. He was the training coordinator. "The Apache isn't a bus for moving soldiers. It's a combat machine. The physical demands alone." "I've passed every physical test the military has," Sarah interrupted. "And I've been certified on the M2 machine gun, the tow missile system, and..." "Being certified isn't the same as being combat ready," Rick said. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a smile that wasn't kind. "Look, Sarah, no offense, but Apache pilots need a certain mentality. They need aggression. They need to make split-second decisions that could kill people. That's not about discrimination. That's just science." Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she kept her voice even. "I've made those decisions before. I've had soldiers' lives depending on my choices." "In a transport bird," Dave said. "That's not the same. The Apache is different. It's not a machine for..." He paused, clearly choosing his words. "It's just not the right fit for everyone." But Sarah heard what he didn't say. It was not the right fit for women. He might as well have written it on the wall. Over the next few weeks, Sarah attended every briefing, every training session, and every qualification course that Apache pilots were required to complete. She studied harder than anyone else in the program. She spent her evenings reading technical manuals, watching flight recordings, and analyzing weapons systems. She ate alone in the cafeteria because pilots from the ready room stopped asking her to join them. The mockery continued in small ways. Someone left a Barbie doll in the pilot's seat of a training simulator, with a note that said, "Your Apache is ready." A senior instructor told her, while other pilots were listening, that her performance reminded him of his daughter learning to drive. Another pilot started calling her Captain Cupcake, and the nickname stuck in ways she couldn't stop. But the worst part wasn't the cruelty. The worst part was that some of it came from people she had respected. People she had flown with. People she had trusted. One evening, Sarah drove back to her small house in the town of Kingsville, about 15 minutes from the base. Kingsville was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. It had a main street with a few local restaurants, a hardware store that had been there for 30 years, and a tight-knit community where military families had lived for generations. Sarah's house was a small 3-bedroom ranch with a white picket fence. She had bought it 5 years ago, thinking it would be the beginning of her roots in one place. Now it felt like a place to hide. She pulled into the driveway and sat in her car for a moment, exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Her neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Price, was watering her garden next door. Eleanor was 73 years old, a widow whose husband had served as a mechanic in the Air Force. She had lived on this street for 40 years. "Sarah!" Eleanor called out, waving. "Come over here a minute." Sarah walked across the yard, grateful for the distraction. Eleanor was one of the few people who treated her normally, without pity or judgment. "I wanted to give you something," Eleanor said. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was a black and white picture of a young woman in a military uniform from the 1980s. "This is my daughter, Catherine." Sarah studied the picture. She had never heard Eleanor mention a daughter before. "Catherine wanted to join the Marines," Eleanor continued. It was 1985. Women weren't really joining the military then, not combat roles anyway. But Catherine was fierce. She was determined. "Her father and I were so proud." Eleanor paused, her eyes growing distant. But she never got to. Her father's commanding officer told him that Catherine would never be accepted. That she wasn't physically suited. That it was a waste of time to try. Eleanor took the photo back and looked at it for a long moment. "Catherine became a nurse instead," Eleanor said softly. "She saved many lives in that career. But I always wondered what she could have been. What she could have done if someone had just believed in her." Eleanor looked at Sarah directly. "Don't let them stop you. Not for a single day." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. She hugged Eleanor, not saying anything, because she couldn't quite find the words. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks. The next morning, Sarah showed up at the base earlier than usual. She had 12 more weeks of Apache training ahead of her. 12 weeks of simulators, weapons courses, and flight training. 12 weeks of proving to every single person who had doubted her that she belonged in that cockpit. She walked into the training facility and didn't look at anyone who was watching. She had a mission now. And nothing, not the mockery, not the doubt, not the cruel jokes, was going to stop her from flying that Apache. No matter how hard she had to fight for it, no matter what it cost her, Sarah Mitchell was going to finish this training. 8 weeks into the Apache training program, Sarah was performing at the top of her class. Her simulator scores were consistently among the highest. In the weapons training courses, she had qualified as expert on every system. In classroom sessions, she asked better questions than pilots with 15 years of experience. By every measurable standard, she was succeeding. But numbers don't change hearts, and data doesn't stop people from being cruel. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was scheduled for her first live weapons qualification flight, a crucial test where she would actually fly in an Apache helicopter and fire real weapons at a target range off the coast of Texas. It was the moment she had been working toward for almost 3 months. It was the moment that would prove, beyond question, that she could do this job. She arrived at the flight line at 6 in the morning. The air was still cool, and the sun was just beginning to turn the sky from black to gray. Her Apache sat on the tarmac, a machine of pure tactical beauty. It was painted in shades of gray and green, with a long gun barrel beneath the cockpit and hardpoints on the wings loaded with Hellfire missiles. She had studied this machine's every detail, dreamed about flying it, imagined the feeling of it responding to her commands. Today, she would finally fly it. Dave Morrison, the training coordinator, was walking around the helicopter with a clipboard. When he saw Sarah, he stopped. His face was unreadable. "Mitchell, he said. "We need to talk." Sarah's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Dave said. "But we have a situation. Your aircraft maintenance is taking longer than expected. We're going to have to push your qualification flight to tomorrow." Sarah felt disappointment, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else. Something in Dave's tone didn't match his words. "What kind of maintenance issue?" she asked. "Hydraulic system," Dave said, not meeting her eyes. "It'll be fine. You'll fly tomorrow instead." Sarah accepted this news, but something felt wrong. That evening, she went back to the flight line after hours. Pilots were allowed to do this to prepare for upcoming flights. She found the Apache sitting in the same spot it had been that morning. The cockpit hatch was open, and she could see inside. There was no one working on it. There was no maintenance being performed. Sarah climbed up and looked inside the cockpit carefully. Everything looked fine. The hydraulic systems appeared normal. The aircraft was ready to fly. She climbed down and sat on the tarmac in the darkness, understanding spreading through her like cold water. They had delayed her flight. They had lied about maintenance because they didn't want her to fly today. The question was, why? The answer came the next morning in a way that made her blood feel like ice. Sarah arrived at the flight line expecting to fly. Instead, she found Dave standing with a man she didn't recognize, someone with stars on his uniform. A general. His name was General Raymond Mitchell. No relation to Sarah, but the coincidence struck her as cruel. "Captain Mitchell," the general said with a sharp nod. "I'm here to observe your weapons qualification. Let's make sure we do this right." Sarah's chest tightened. A general didn't show up for routine pilot qualifications. This was a test, but not the kind she had expected. This was a test of whether she would break under pressure. This was a test designed to make her fail. The flight itself was scheduled to last 2 hours. Sarah would fly out to the range, fire her weapons at stationary targets, and demonstrate her ability to operate the Apache's weapons systems in a combat scenario. It should be straightforward. She had done similar exercises in the simulator 50 times. But as she climbed into the cockpit with her weapons officer, a senior captain named James Chen who had been polite but distant, she could feel the weight of General Mitchell's presence like a physical thing. The engines roared to life. The rotors began to spin. Sarah felt the familiar vibration that came before a helicopter left the ground. She had a moment, just a moment, of pure joy. She was flying the Apache. After months of fighting for this moment, she was in the cockpit. Then James spoke over the radio. "Control, this is Apache 2-1, he said. "Requesting clearance for weapons range." "Copy that, 2-1, came the response from the tower. "You are cleared to proceed. Be advised, we have Observer 1 on this flight. Let's make it a good one." Observer 1. That was the general. The flight to the weapons range took 40 minutes. Sarah handled the controls smoothly, executing turns and climbs that she had practiced hundreds of times. The Apache responded beautifully to her touch. She could feel the power of the machine beneath her hands, and it felt right. It felt like coming home. Then they reached the target range. The targets were set up on a flat section of desert, large metal frames shaped like enemy vehicles. Sarah lined up for her first run. She had to fire 3 Hellfire missiles as part of the test. 3 shots. 3 hits. That's what qualified you as combat-ready with the Apache's primary weapons system. She locked onto the first target. The weapons system confirmed acquisition. She squeezed the trigger. The missile fired. It streaked across the desert toward the target. And then, nothing. No explosion. The missile missed by 20 feet, detonating in empty sand. Sarah's heart sank, but she forced herself to stay calm. One miss happens. Pilots miss. It was about consistency. She lined up for the second shot. "Take your time," James said over the radio. His voice was neutral, but Sarah detected something underneath it. Satisfaction, maybe. Or anticipation of failure. She locked onto the second target. She was more careful this time, taking longer to ensure the weapons system was perfectly calibrated. She squeezed the trigger again. Another miss. This time, only by 15 feet, but still a miss. Sarah felt sweat on her forehead. Something was wrong. Her calculations were correct. The targeting system appeared to be working normally. But her shots weren't connecting. "Third shot, Captain," James said calmly. "Make it count." Sarah focused everything she had on that third shot. She locked onto the target. She double-checked her calculations. She verified the weapon system status. Everything looked perfect. She squeezed the trigger. The third missile fired. It streaked toward the target. It was going to hit. She could feel it. At the last possible moment, the missile veered. Just slightly. Just enough. It missed by 30 feet, hitting the ground next to the target frame. 3 shots. 0 hits. The silence over the radio was absolute. Then James spoke. "Control, Apache 2-1 is returning to base. Weapons qualification incomplete." The flight back was the longest flight of Sarah's life. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat in the cockpit with her hands on the controls, feeling like she had stepped outside of her body and was watching someone else's life fall apart. When they landed, General Mitchell was waiting. His face was impassive, but his eyes were cold. "Your weapon's accuracy is unacceptable, Captain Mitchell," he said. "I'm placing you on a 2-week suspension from all Apache training pending a full investigation into the targeting system calibration on this aircraft." "Sir," Sarah started, "the targeting system." "I don't want to hear excuses," the general said flatly. "You're dismissed, Captain. Report back to your commanding officer." Sarah walked back to the ready room in a fog. Her hands were shaking. She had trained for 3 months. She had studied harder than anyone. She had proven herself in every simulator, in every classroom, in every single test except this one. And this one, she was suddenly certain, had been rigged. But how could she prove that? How could she prove that they had sabotaged her qualification flight? They would claim it was a weapons system malfunction. They would say the targeting system was the problem, not her piloting. And she would have to accept it, because she had no evidence. No proof. Nothing but her own certainty that she had been cheated. That evening, Sarah went home and sat on her back porch. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. She thought about Eleanor's daughter, Catherine, who had never gotten to try. She thought about all the women in military history who had wanted to fly but were never given the chance. And she thought about giving up. It would be so easy to quit. To go back to flying transport helicopters. To accept that some doors were locked and some ceilings couldn't be broken through. She could have a peaceful life. She could stop fighting. But then she thought about the look on General Mitchell's face. She thought about the satisfaction in James Chen's voice. She thought about Dave Morrison's lie about maintenance. And she thought about how they would tell this story for years, the woman who couldn't handle the Apache. Sarah made a decision in that moment. She was going to find out what happened on that flight. She was going to find evidence of what they had done. And she was going to make them all answer for it. She didn't know yet how she would do it, or what the cost would be. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't going to quit. The 2-week suspension felt like a lifetime. Sarah was not allowed on the flight line, not allowed in the ready room, not allowed to access any Apache training materials. She was essentially locked out of the world she had fought so hard to join. She spent her days filing paperwork in the administration office, busy work designed to keep her out of sight and out of mind. But during those 2 weeks, Sarah did something that would change everything. She started investigating. She couldn't access the flight line, but she had friends. Not many, but enough. One of them was Lieutenant Marcus Washington, a weapons officer who had always treated her with respect. He was African American and had his own stories about not fitting into the old boys' club of military aviation. When Sarah asked him to help her, he didn't hesitate. "The weapons system logs should tell us what happened," Marcus said. They were meeting in the parking lot of a coffee shop off base, away from anyone who might see them together. "Every shot, every target lock, every weapon system status, it's all recorded. If there was a malfunction, it will be in those logs. Can you access them?" Sarah asked. "Not officially," Marcus said. "But I know someone in maintenance who owes me a favor. Give me a day." 24 hours later, Marcus slipped Sarah a USB drive in a sealed envelope. Sarah took it home and plugged it into her personal laptop, making sure to use a VPN to hide her location. What she found made her blood run cold. The weapon system logs showed something extraordinary. On 3 of her shots, the targeting system had performed flawlessly. The locks had been perfect. The calculations had been correct. But, and this was the crucial detail, someone had manually overridden the weapons system guidance after the lock was confirmed but before the missiles fired. Someone in the cockpit had deliberately altered the flight path of those missiles. Sarah sat back in her chair, understanding the full scope of what had happened. One of 2 people had done this, James Chen, her weapons officer, or someone who had access to override the weapons system while they were in flight. Given that James was sitting directly behind her in the gunner's seat, where all weapons system controls were located, the answer was clear. James Chen had sabotaged her qualification flight. But why? That was the question that kept Sarah awake that night. James had been nothing but professional. He had never said anything insulting. He had never been unkind. So why would he do this? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah had been friends with James's ex-wife before they divorced 2 years ago. Her name was Michelle, and they had kept in touch. Sarah called her carefully, using her personal phone and speaking vaguely about needing some information. "James was passed over for a promotion last year," Michelle said. "He didn't get the slot for the advanced weapons training program. The commanders said they wanted someone younger, someone they were developing for the long term." "That doesn't seem fair," Sarah said. "No, it's not," Michelle agreed. James was bitter about it. He felt like he had done his time, proved himself. And then they bring in you, a woman, someone with less experience as an Apache pilot, and they're willing to let you try for something he never got the chance to try for himself. Sarah understood. James hadn't sabotaged her because she was a woman, not exactly. He had sabotaged her because he was angry. Angry at the system. Angry at the military. Angry at being told he wasn't good enough. And Sarah had become a convenient target for that rage. It was a painful understanding, but it didn't change what he had done. The next morning, Sarah made an appointment with the Inspector General's office. The IG was an independent authority within the military who could investigate claims of abuse of power, discrimination, and sabotage. It was a serious step. If she filed a complaint, it would set off a chain reaction that she couldn't control. But if she didn't, they would bury this. They would move on. And she would never fly an Apache. The IG officer was a woman named Captain Susan Rodriguez. She was professional, skeptical, and thorough. She reviewed the weapons system logs without any change of expression. She asked Sarah detailed questions about the flight. And then she said something that Sarah didn't expect. "This is serious," Captain Rodriguez said. "If these logs show what I think they show, this is deliberate sabotage of a military training operation. This is career-ending for whoever did this." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "And you're sure you want to pursue this?" Rodriguez asked. "Once this complaint is filed, it can't be unfiled. These men will know it came from you. The attention will be enormous. And there's no guarantee the outcome will be what you want. Sarah thought about Eleanor's daughter, Catherine. She thought about all the women who had been told no. She thought about the mockery and the lies and the deliberate attempt to make her fail. She thought about how none of that had been her fault, and all of it had been someone else's choice to do to her. "I'm sure," Sarah said. The investigation took 3 weeks. Captain Rodriguez subpoenaed the weapons system logs, interviewed personnel who had been at the flight line, and reviewed communications between the pilots. The evidence was overwhelming. James Chen had deliberately overridden the targeting system on all 3 missiles. There was no ambiguity. No room for interpretation. James was arrested on base and charged with sabotage of a military training operation. It was a serious crime. His military career was over. But the investigation didn't stop with James. It expanded. Captain Rodriguez started asking questions about why he had done it. She looked into his personnel file. She interviewed his commanding officers. And what she found was a pattern of pilots being passed over, of promotions going to others, of resentment and anger building for years. And underneath that pattern, she found something more disturbing. She found a culture of deliberate exclusion. She found evidence that women who had requested Apache training in the past had been talked out of it. She found emails, casual, joking, but deeply damaging, where male pilots discussed ways to discourage women from pursuing combat aviation. The investigation spiraled upward through the chain of command. It reached General Mitchell. It reached his commanding officer. And when Captain Rodriguez finished her investigation, her report was over 100 pages long. It was a detailed account not just of what James Chen had done to Sarah, but of what the entire command structure had allowed to happen, systematically, for years. 2 days before the investigation was complete, Sarah's commanding officer, Colonel Robert Harrison, asked to meet with her privately in his office. Colonel Harrison was an old-school military man, 61 years old, career military, someone who had come up through the ranks when the military was even more male-dominated than it was now. Sarah had expected him to be against her. But when she walked into his office, she saw something she didn't expect. Regret. "Captain Mitchell," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I want to apologize." Sarah sat down slowly, uncertain what was happening. "I allowed a culture to develop in my command that was hostile to you," Colonel Harrison said. "Not directly. I never said anything to you personally. But I allowed other men to mock you. I allowed rumors to spread. I didn't step in when I should have, because part of me was skeptical about whether you belonged here." He paused, looking at his hands. "I'm 61 years old," he continued. "I've been in the military for 40 years. I came up in an era when women weren't pilots. And I carried that bias with me. It was wrong. And more than that, it was damaging to a good officer." Sarah didn't know what to say. "Captain Rodriguez's investigation is going to tear this command apart," Colonel Harrison said. "General Mitchell will likely be relieved of command. James Chen will face military court. And changes are going to be made to how we handle training and personnel." He looked at Sarah. "You did the right thing by pursuing this. It was brave." That evening, Sarah sat with Eleanor on her front porch, watching the sun set over Kingsville. Eleanor held her hand without saying much of anything. "The investigation will be public," Sarah said. "There will be a trial. People will know what happened." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "And what will happen next?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I'll be allowed back in training. But it will be different now. Everyone will know why." "Does that bother you?" Eleanor asked. Sarah thought about that. She thought about walking back into that ready room. She thought about the faces of the men who had mocked her. She thought about James Chen and General Mitchell and Dave Morrison. She thought about all of them being forced to acknowledge that she had been right and they had been wrong. The military court-martial of Captain James Chen took 6 weeks. It was a high-profile case made more complicated by the broader investigation into command climate within the squadron. Testimony was given by dozens of witnesses. The weapons system logs were presented as evidence. James's own supervisors testified about his access to the targeting system controls. In the end, James was convicted on 2 counts, sabotage of a military training operation and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. He was sentenced to 18 months in the naval brig and received a dishonorable discharge. His career was over. But James's conviction was only the beginning of the real reckoning. General Raymond Mitchell was relieved of command pending a full investigation into his command philosophy and his role in creating a hostile training environment. Officers under his command came forward with stories of discrimination, of promotions being distributed unfairly, of women being systematically discouraged from certain positions. Dave Morrison, the training coordinator, was transferred out of aviation training entirely. The evidence of his deliberate maintenance scheduling lies was clear, and while he wasn't court-martialed, the military rarely prosecutes officers for smaller transgressions. His career was effectively over. He would spend his remaining years in a desk job, away from pilots and training. Rick, the senior captain who had mocked Sarah most vocally, requested a transfer to a different base. He didn't want to face her every day. And Sarah? Sarah was cleared to return to Apache training immediately, with a full apology from her new commanding officer and full credit for the weeks she had spent in suspension. But the bigger change came from above. A new commander was assigned to the squadron, a man named Admiral James Thornton who had a reputation for wanting to modernize the military and break down the barriers that had existed for decades. Admiral Thornton's first official action was to observe Sarah's weapons qualification flight personally. This time, there was no sabotage. This time, there was no deception. The Apache sat on the tarmac, fully functional and properly maintained. Sarah's new weapons officer was a woman named Captain Lisa Torres, who had broken barriers of her own as the first Latina pilot in her squadron. Sarah climbed into the cockpit with a clarity she had never felt before. She was ready. The machine was ready. And the people who wanted to see her fail had been removed from her path. The flight to the weapons range was smooth and uneventful. Sarah felt the Apache respond to her controls with perfect precision. The engines hummed beneath her. The rotors beat the air in a steady rhythm. She was completely in command. When they reached the range, Sarah lined up for her first shot. She locked onto the target. She verified the system. And this time, with absolute certainty, she squeezed the trigger. The missile fired. It streaked across the desert in a perfect arc. It hit the target dead center. The explosion bloomed against the sky like a flower. Target 1 destroyed, Lisa said over the radio, her voice filled with what sounded like pure pride. The second shot came quickly. Perfect lock. Perfect calculation. Perfect execution. Another dead center hit. Target 2 destroyed, Lisa said. Sarah was smiling now, though no one could see it beneath her helmet. She had waited months for this moment. She had fought through mockery, lies, and deliberate sabotage to get here. And now, finally, she was flying an Apache in combat conditions, and she was the best there was. The third shot was the fastest yet. Sarah had learned from her previous training. She had studied every millisecond of the process. She locked, calculated, and fired in one smooth motion. The third missile hit its target with perfect precision. All targets destroyed, Lisa said. Captain Mitchell, you are officially combat ready in the AH-64 Apache helicopter. Sarah felt something release inside her chest, something that had been held tight since the moment she had signed that first transfer request. It was over. She had done it. Despite everything, despite everyone, she had done it. When they landed, Admiral Thornton was waiting on the tarmac. He walked out to meet Sarah as she climbed down from the cockpit. He was a tall man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire life in leadership positions. "Captain Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "Congratulations on your successful qualification. You're now a fully certified Apache pilot." Sarah shook his hand, still unable to quite believe it was real. "I've read the entire investigative report into your case," Admiral Thornton continued. "And I want you to know that I find the conduct of the officers involved to be absolutely unacceptable. That kind of culture has no place in modern military aviation. We're better than that." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "No, thank you," the Admiral replied. "Thank you for having the courage to come forward. Thank you for holding people accountable. And thank you for proving, beyond any doubt, that you belong in that cockpit." The next morning, Sarah attended her first official briefing as a certified Apache pilot. The ready room went quiet when she walked in. Every eye was on her. And for the first time, there was no mockery. There was no laughter. There was something else, respect. Hard-earned, honest respect. Sarah was assigned her first official combat mission a week later. Her commanding officer was a major named David Chen, no relation to James. He was younger than Sarah by 5 years, and he had come up through the ranks during a time when change was already happening in the military. "You're going to be my weapons officer on this mission," Major Chen told her. "We have reports of hostile activity near the base perimeter. Low risk, probably just smugglers, but we need to check it out. Are you ready?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "I'm ready." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, thinking about the weight of what she had accomplished. She had done more than just become an Apache pilot. She had changed the culture of her entire command. She had held people accountable for their actions. She had opened a door that generations of women would now be able to walk through. At 3 in the morning, Sarah got out of bed and walked to her kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window, looking out at the sleeping town of Kingsville. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Price was also asleep, probably dreaming the dreams of someone who had seen justice done. Sarah thought about Eleanor's daughter, Catherine. She thought about how Catherine would never get the chance to fly an Apache, how that door had been closed to her forever. But now, women coming after Sarah would get that chance. That door was open, and Sarah's blood and struggle had purchased it for them. The next morning, Sarah reported to the flight line. The Apache was waiting, gleaming in the dawn light. She climbed into the cockpit and felt the familiar weight of the controls beneath her hands. This wasn't just a training flight anymore. This was real. This was her life now. She heard Major Chen's voice over the radio. 2-1 is ready for launch, he said. "Roger that, 2-1, came the response from the tower. "You are cleared for takeoff." The engines roared to life. The rotors began to spin. And Captain Sarah Mitchell, the woman whom so many had believed didn't belong, lifted the Apache off the ground and climbed into the Texas sky. Sarah's first combat mission was uneventful in the way that good missions often are. She and Major Chen flew south of the base, investigated the reported activity, which turned out to be a group of migrant workers moving through the desert at night, and confirmed that there was no military threat. They returned to base and filed their report. It was routine. It was professional. It was exactly what she had trained to do. Over the next 6 months, Sarah flew 17 more missions. She logged over 200 flight hours in the Apache. She became known throughout the squadron as a cool, competent pilot who made smart decisions under pressure. The mockery didn't just stop, it reversed. Men who had insulted her began asking for her as their pilot for missions. Her name appeared in commendations. She was asked to help train new pilots. The story of what had happened to her spread through the military aviation community. Other women started requesting Apache training. Other women started believing they could do it. At Naval Air Station Kingsville alone, 4 women entered Apache pilot training within the first year after Sarah's qualification. 3 of them completed the program successfully. Sarah's case became a turning point. An investigation was launched military-wide into gender bias in aviation training programs. New policies were implemented. Commanding officers were trained in how to create inclusive command climates. And Sarah was invited to speak at military conferences about her experience. It was success beyond what she had imagined. But then, on a normal Tuesday in the middle of an otherwise routine month, something happened that made everything that had come before seem like just the beginning. Sarah received a call from someone she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and careful. "Captain Mitchell. My name is Colonel Patricia Williams. I'm calling from the Pentagon. I have a situation I need to discuss with you, and I'd appreciate it if you kept this conversation confidential until I give you permission to share it with others." Sarah's instincts immediately went on alert. Classified information. High-level military. This was something big. "Of course, Colonel," Sarah said. "What can I do for you?" What happened next was shocking. Colonel Williams explained that she was part of a task force reviewing command decisions made by senior officers over the past 2 years. Part of that review involved looking at the investigation into the sabotage of Sarah's training flight. But there was something that hadn't come up in the original investigation, something that had been discovered more recently. In reviewing communications between General Mitchell and his superiors, Colonel Williams explained, "We discovered something curious." General Mitchell contacted Admiral Curtis Harrison, the Admiral is chairman of an aviation procurement committee, immediately after your weapons qualification flight failed. In that communication, General Mitchell referenced your failure specifically and used it as justification for a recommendation regarding Apache procurement policy. Sarah didn't understand. "What kind of policy?" she asked. "This is where it gets complicated," Colonel Williams said. General Mitchell recommended that the military should re-evaluate whether women should be certified for Apache pilot positions, citing your poor performance as an example of why women might not be suited for this particular aircraft. He was trying to use your sabotage training flight as evidence against female pilots in combat roles. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. "But here's the thing," Colonel Williams continued. "Admiral Harrison didn't buy it. He looked at the investigative report more carefully, and he started asking his own questions. He discovered the weapons system logs. He discovered the sabotage. And when he did, he made a decision." "What decision?" Sarah asked. "He went to Inspector General Rodriguez and told her to expand the investigation. He told her to look into whether General Mitchell had deliberately arranged for your sabotage to fail so he could use it against female pilots in combat. He told her to look into whether this was part of a deliberate strategy to keep women out of Apache training." Sarah couldn't speak. The idea that it went that deep, that high level, that deliberate, it was almost too much to comprehend. "The investigation found that it was," Colonel Williams said quietly. General Mitchell had conversations with other senior officers about the problem of women entering combat aviation. He was actively trying to maintain the existing structure. When you requested Apache training, he apparently saw you as a threat to that structure. So he arranged for your sabotage. He arranged for it? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "How did he arrange it?" "Through James Chen," Colonel Williams said. "We have new evidence, messages that came to light in a recent subpoena, showing that General Mitchell spoke privately with James Chen before your qualification flight. In those conversations, he reminded James of his own career disappointments and made it clear that a poor performance from you would be very helpful to many people. He didn't explicitly order the sabotage, but the implication was clear." Sarah couldn't breathe. It was worse than she had thought. Far worse. James Chen hadn't acted alone, out of bitterness. He had been manipulated by his commanding general. He had been told, in so many words, that sabotaging her would help his career. It had been a setup from the very top. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Because we're about to make an announcement, Colonel Williams said. And I wanted you to hear it from me first, before it becomes public. General Mitchell is being court-martialed on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He deliberately tried to sabotage the career of a military pilot based on her gender, and then tried to use that sabotage as evidence for a broader exclusion of women from combat roles. What about James Chen? Sarah asked. He's already been convicted. His conviction stands, Colonel Williams said. But he's going to receive a reduced sentence. It turns out he was acting under orders, even if those orders were informal and implied. He's still guilty of the sabotage, but the court will take into account that he was manipulated by a senior officer. Sarah didn't know how to feel about that. Justice was complicated. Fairness was complicated. But she understood that this was the right outcome. There's more, Colonel Williams said. A new policy is being implemented military-wide. Women are being actively recruited for combat aviation training, and there are going to be oversight committees to ensure that bias isn't allowed to influence training decisions. None of this would be happening if you hadn't had the courage to file that complaint. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her living room for a long time, not moving. She thought about the past year and a half of her life. She thought about the mockery, the sabotage, the investigation, the triumph of qualifying, and now this, the revelation that it had all been part of a conscious effort to keep her out. But she wasn't destroyed by this knowledge. Instead, she felt something else. She felt the weight of understanding just how much she had accomplished. She had done more than just become an Apache pilot. She had exposed corruption at the highest levels of command. She had forced the military to change. She had opened doors that would never be closed again. That evening, Eleanor came over, and Sarah told her everything. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious as the story unfolded. You know what this means? Eleanor said when Sarah had finished. This means Catherine's dream of being a pilot wasn't just taken away from her because she was born at the wrong time. It was kept away from her because there were people like General Mitchell who were actively trying to maintain a system that excluded women. And if you hadn't fought back, if you hadn't been brave enough to challenge them, that system would still be in place today. I know, Sarah said. And you changed it, Eleanor continued. She reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. You did what I wished Catherine could have done. You fought them, and you won. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. The announcement came 2 weeks later. Major news outlets ran the story. General court-martialed for conspiracy against female pilot. Military investigating gender bias in combat training. Woman pilot wins justice against top general. The trial was intense and very public. General Mitchell's defense was essentially that he had simply been skeptical about female combat pilots, which was not, his attorneys argued, a crime. They said his communications with James Chen had been misinterpreted, that he had never explicitly ordered the sabotage. But the prosecution presented message after message, email after email, showing a pattern of bias and deliberate exclusion. They showed how General Mitchell had tried to use Sarah's sabotaged failure as propaganda against female pilots. They showed how he had deliberately created a culture in his command that was hostile to women in combat roles. The court-martial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict came down on a Friday afternoon. General Raymond Mitchell was found guilty on 3 of the 4 counts: obstruction of justice, conspiracy to deprive a military member of equal protection under military law, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was sentenced to dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and confinement for 3 years. His military career was over. His reputation was destroyed. He would go to a federal prison for military personnel and spend 3 years there, unable to deny what he had done, unable to make excuses. But the biggest victory came a month later, when Admiral Thornton called Sarah into his office. Captain Mitchell, he said, I have an announcement. You've been promoted to major. Effective immediately. And you've been assigned as the new commander of the Apache training program here at Kingsville. Sarah couldn't speak. She was the training commander. She would be responsible for selecting and training every Apache pilot who came through her program. She would set the culture. She would make sure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. There's more, Admiral Thornton said. I've recommended you for accelerated promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, and I expect that to go through within the next year. And I've suggested your name to the Pentagon for a new aviation diversity initiative they're starting. Major, your career is going to be extraordinary. Sarah left that office in a daze. She had wanted to fly an Apache. That's what she had fought for. But in fighting for that, she had accomplished something far greater. She had changed an entire institution. That evening, Sarah flew one of her last missions as a regular Apache pilot before transitioning to command. She took the controls of the helicopter as the sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and purple. She thought about the young women who would come into her training program in the coming years, women who would see her and understand that they could do this. That they could fly. That they belonged. Sarah looked down at the landscape below, the small towns, the military bases, the highways stretching across the desert, and she allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. They had mocked her. They had lied to her. They had tried to destroy her career before it really started. But Sarah Mitchell had not just survived. She had triumphed. And in triumphing, she had changed the world for everyone who would come after her. As she brought the Apache back toward the base, she transmitted one final message to the tower. Apache 2-1, returning home. Thank you for the clear skies. The response came back clear and strong. Welcome home, Apache 2-1. You've earned it. And for the first time since she had started this impossible journey, Sarah Mitchell knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not just in that cockpit, not just in that military base, but in her life. Finally, after all the struggle and pain and sacrifice, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.